We had a good time of prayer this morning in our 10 a.m. Bible study. Be sure to join us next week. It was just good to spend time with brothers and sisters in prayer and to just spend that time, just begin that process of praying and asking God what His will is and what He would have us do and asking to draw near to Him. So it was a good time. I really enjoyed it. This week I was studying for the scriptures, and I was looking at some articles, and I came across this article. It's from relevantmagazine.com, and the article was titled, 20 Things We Would Tell Ourselves, 20 Things We Would Tell Our 20-something Selves. Okay, so if you're not over 20, that, it doesn't apply to you. But thinking about it, it began a thought process in my life, and actually God did a couple of things this week along the same topic, and even the scriptures kind of go along that line. But what would you do if you could go back in time and tell your 20-something self to do differently? What would you do? Or even if you're a high schooler and you go back in middle school, or apply it to your life, what would you do? And this forced me to examine my life. Who was I? Who am I now? And who am I going to be? What am I going to look like in 20 years? Right? It sounds like a job interview. Where do you see yourself in 10 years? Right? Maybe we as a Christians should ask ourselves that. But along the same lines, we're going to be looking at the scriptures today as Acts 24 through 26. I'm not going to read that whole segment. Just a portion of that, but this is going to be my last sermon from the Acts series. Next week, Pastor Dennis is going to wrap up the book of Acts, so I left him with the hard part, right? How do you close? And there's a bunch of chapters in there, but it's been an exciting process just to see what God's doing through this book of Acts. I've been challenged, and so having it be my last sermon in this book of Acts, I asked myself, how should I close this? What should I do? And so looking at this, I wanted to give an overall picture of the Apostle Paul, what drives him, what was his secret to success, and how can we apply that to our own lives and to our church. So looking at that, let me read just a portion of this, and I put it up. And I might have an older version that I put up there, but it's Acts 26, 12 through 18. Let me read this. On one of these journeys, and this is Paul, and he's standing before kings and governors and nobles, and he's given his testimony, and he says these words. On one of these journeys, I was going to Damascus with the authority and commission of our chief priest. About noon, O king, and this is the king he's addressing, as I was on the road, I saw a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, blazing around me and my companions. We all fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying to me in Aramaic, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. Then I asked, Who are you, Lord? I am Jesus, who you are persecuting, the Lord replied. Now get up and stand on your feet. I have appeared to you to appoint you as a servant and a witness of what you have seen of me and what I will show you. I will rescue you from your own people and from the Gentiles. I am sending you to them to open their eyes, to turn them from the darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, so that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me. So the first thing, looking at the life of Paul, and even from his testimony, I can see this, and this is what I want to point out, and this is central to our life, and it's this, the centrality of Christ in our life. Now, just in these 7 verses, you can get a glimpse of how Christ is central to Paul and his mission and to who he was, everything about him. Verse 15, you see that. Well, you're looking at this, and verse 15 of what I just read, Paul, in fact, I'll put it up. Paul and Jesus, you see that he speaks from heaven. This is kind of what begins Paul's mission. And Jesus, now if you think about that, Jesus speaks from heaven. That actually has huge implications. Number one, and I've just given a couple of them, Jesus hears and he sees and he pays attention to everything that was happening in Paul's life as well as matters here on earth. The centrality of Christ. Number two, Jesus speaks to people from heaven. Now, Jesus is at the right hand of the Father on the throne, but he speaks to people from heaven. He did it 2,000 years ago. Does he still do it today? This is a question. Is he still central to his mission, to his gospel, to his church, to his people? I believe he is. Last Saturday, I was at Calvary Baptist Church. There's 400 lay leaders, pastors, ministers, missionaries, and the title of the conference had something to do with reaching the Muslim world, those people who follow Islam, who follow Muhammad. So there were 400 people there. It was an amazing conference. We spent time in prayer. We got to hear people give testimonies. I put a video clip on my Facebook page, my own Facebook page, one of the videos that we watched at that conference about a girl from Iraq who had, her village had been destroyed, and she forgave those people who destroyed her village, and then she gave a testimony of how we should love them. So all of this stuff happened, but what I want to get to is something that kept coming up was that Jesus was speaking to Muslim people through dreams and through visions. And so this has huge implications. It means that Jesus is speaking to people here on earth. Have you heard of this before? I first heard of this when I was in college. This guy, he was from Turkey, and he confessed that Jesus had appeared to him in a dream, and he actually believed that it was Jesus, but he refused to convert to Christianity. So he knew that so that was somebody, but actually in San Francisco, and this is a long story, I could tell you later, but we had one day, two girls, they walked in, they were college students, and they walked into our church, and this was a Chinese church in Chinatown in San Francisco, and they walked in and they said, we're looking for the 4 books. And I was like, well, we have 4 gospels, maybe that's what you mean, so I probably shared this story before, but I took them to a coffee house, grabbed another lady from the church, and we went and shared Christ with them, and they had so many questions. But it turns out that they were at that church that morning because all the way in the Middle East, I don't want to say what country, but their mother had received a vision from Jesus. Jesus had appeared to their mother in a dream, and she came to believe, she became a Christian, and somebody in Turkey had given her a Bible. She hid it under her bed. She faced execution for becoming a believer. And all of this because Christ was speaking to her, and he's still speaking from heaven. And by the way, got to baptize those 3 ladies. The mother came, got to baptize her, and the 2 daughters from who were in college. So Jesus is speaking from heaven is central to his message, to his gospel. Verse 15, in these, let me flip back to it. Verse 15, Jesus tells, he says to Paul, and he says, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? So another thing that this tells me is that Jesus is central to his church. Paul is persecuting Christians, and at this time he's not a believer, and he's imprisoning them, and he's even going from city to city to track them down and to turn them in and help them become tried and stoned, basically. And so Jesus says, why are you persecuting me? He doesn't say, why are you persecuting them? So this tells me that Jesus is central to his church. He's there when these people are being persecuted. Even Jesus said that. He said, John 15:18, he said, if the world hates you, keep in mind that they hated me first. Matthew 10:22, Jesus says, all men will hate you because of me. And then Matthew 5:11, Jesus says, blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evils against you because of me. Jesus, I could go on and on, but Jesus is still central to his church. He's there. Continuing on, in these verses, in number 17, I took the numbers out, but 17, Jesus says he will rescue Paul. Verse 18, Jesus will open their eyes, and then Jesus will turn them from darkness to light, and then Jesus will turn the people from the power of Satan to the power of God, and then Jesus will forgive their sins, and then Jesus will sanctify them by faith in Jesus. Do you get what I'm saying here? The centrality of Christ is in Paul's testimony. What's the secret to Paul's success? Christ. Keeping Jesus center. These are Paul's words proclaiming that Christ is the center of his life and center of his calling, center of his mission, and center of his purpose. And that brings us quickly to the second point, which is this, that each and every one of us has a story inside of us. Now, the premise behind these three chapters in Acts 24 to 26, without getting into the long history, is actually extraordinary. If I could put it one way, this is the beginning of the end of Paul's mission, of his calling. Very shortly after these verses, Paul, he writes to the person he was discipling, Timothy, and he says to Timothy, he sends him this letter, and he takes the time to write this, and by the time he can hardly even write his name, and he says to Timothy, "For I am already being poured out like a drink offering, and the time for my departure is near. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith." So shortly after Paul says these things, he writes to Timothy, and he says, "My time is near. I've already done everything." So we know that Paul, he's heading to his end. So Paul knew his time was going to the end. He wanted to finish well. He writes these things about running the race to get the prize. In that same analogy, he talks about, do I box in the air? I think Paul was boxing for a KO, if you know what that means. He wanted to end his life with something extraordinary. He wanted to preach to Caesar himself. Now, I'm kind of summarizing what's happening in these couple of verses, but if you know anything about Roman history, you know that you've probably heard of the Emperor Nero, the guy who is attributed to burning down Rome, or is it Athens? And anyways, he's due with fire, okay? And there's a lot of atrocities that history attributes to him. But what I want to get to is basically Nero, who Paul went to go preach to, was the most powerful and influential man of the Roman Empire, and maybe the entire world. So to put it into perspective, it would be like me saying, I'm going to go preach to Obama or to Putin or the most influential person or people in the world. And this was a tall order. But Paul, he wanted to do this. This was his desire. In fact, God even commissioned him. God even confirmed this desire in his mission. So Paul's like, I'm going to go preach to Caesar. There's a whole story of how he was on trial there, but he said that he wanted to go to Caesar to get this trial fixed. And so somehow, I don't want to go to story, but he arranged for him to go see Caesar in his household. And so Paul, this is my mission. And then God, he approved it. And so God sent Paul this angel. Paul he was headed to Rome to go see the emperor, and then he gets in shipwreck, and read the history. Actually, Dennis might talk about this next week. But then God sends the angel, and the angel says to Paul, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar. And by the way, and God has graciously given you the lives of all of those who sail with you." So this angel comes and confirms Paul's calling. So we have Paul, who's commissioned by Christ to preach to the Gentile. Paul gets in his heart to preach a gospel to the most powerful man on earth, and then God confirms Paul's mission to him. When I read this and put this together, this famous quote came to mind. It says, "I love it when a plan comes together." You may know that. A-Team. I actually grew up on the original A-Team. Okay. I love it when a plan comes together. That's what's happening in Paul's life. Paul's life mission is coming to fruition. The pieces are falling into place. He has an audience before governors, before nobles, before kings, and eventually before the most powerful man on earth. So this brings up the question, if you had a chance to stand before the most powerful man on earth, what would you say? I remember, and this is kind of a funny, embarrassing story, but when I was in high school, I took this international trip to Ireland, and on this trip, it was a peacemaking trip. We had half Catholics and half Protestants on our team. We were high schoolers, and we went to Ireland, and we went to high schools in Ireland, and we spoke to Catholic high schools and then to Protestant high schools, and we showed them how we could get together, how we could get along as Protestants and Catholics, and they asked us questions. We also got to visit businesses, and they actually gave us a key to the city. We could go to any pool or whatever we wanted. It was really cool as a senior in high school. Imagine that. Your parents weren't there. You're in Ireland. And anyways, it was great. But on one of these days, we were there for a couple weeks. We got to go to Belfast and visit an influential politician. I don't remember his name, but he was very influential. And he had his secretary pour us tea. Anybody ever had tea time in Ireland or England? It's a very common tradition. I love it. So we're sitting there drinking tea, sipping tea. Remember, I'm a high schooler. And we start to talk about our lives. This politician starts asking us, where are you from? And then pretty soon they start talking about a guy named John Major, who we were supposed to meet that afternoon. And then I said the stupidest question. If you could go back 20 years, right, this is what I would change, right? I said, who is John Major, right? And you guys may not know, but John Major was the Prime Minister of England at that time. So it would be like coming to America and saying, meeting with a congressman and then asking them, who is Obama, right? So the point being, if you were in a situation when you could share with influential people, or even the most influential person in the world, what would you say? Or in my case, what would you not say? Right? Look into the scripture. This is what Paul says. And let me summarize it. And it's from what I just read. Paul says this: I persecuted and I arrested Christians. Jesus blinded me and he spoke to me from heaven. And now I'm a Christian myself. And I'm turning others from the power of Satan to the power of God. Now I'm on a mission to lead people to Jesus, who forgives sins and makes people holy by placing their faith in him. Summarization. Now, I bring up this point that each of us has a story inside of us, because one day you might have the opportunity to turn others from the power of Satan to the power of God. One day you may stand before another and tell them that Jesus forgives sins, that Jesus makes people holy, and that by placing your faith in Jesus, you too can have a place besides Jesus for all of eternity. This is called your testimony. This is called your salvation story. This is putting into words what God has done in your life. This is telling others that Jesus saved you from the grip of death to the power of eternal life. This is confessing before the world that you belong to Jesus, and that others can do the same. This is your testimony. By the way, your testimony is in the scriptures. Revelation 12:11 tells us that in the end times, that Christians will triumph over Satan by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. I'll say that one more time. Revelation 12:11 is a prophecy that Christians, believers in Christ, will overcome, will triumph, I love that word, triumph over Satan by the blood of the Lamb, that's Jesus, and by the word of their testimony. If you were to stand before the world today to testify about Jesus, what would you say? Are you ready to share your testimony? Do you know what your testimony is? These are the questions we should ask ourselves. And I close this point by saying one more thing, that I really believe in this power of testimony and telling others what Christ has done in your life. When I teach evangelism, I always start with, how do you share your testimony? You can get it down to 2 minutes. I have all these things you can include, and for everybody it's going to be different. But how do you share your testimony? If you don't know how to share your testimony, then I would love to teach you. Come to me. I can teach you these things. We can share, and I will make you go do it in the streets. So don't want to scare you. But there's nothing better than practice, right? One last thing about this, power of testimony. I know about sharing your testimony. I do it all the time, but I realized the importance of testimony at this one particular story that really concreted it for me, as if Revelation 12:11 wasn't enough. When I was in seminary, we had a missions conference every year, and we had a lady who was a missionary to the Mormons. In fact, she herself had been a Mormon. She married a Mormon, and then she became a Christian after she was a Mormon. And so the church annulled her marriage and kicked her out of the Church of Mormon. So she, after that, became an evangelist to Mormons. And she had on her heart to share with them the gospel of Christ. So she came and she shared these fantastic stories about, what's in their temple and how do you witness to them and all these things. And I was perplexed because by that point, I had already shared with many Mormons. I had taken 2 mission trips to Utah to share with the Mormons. I had actually gone in their temple, done their whole tour, prayed with people in their temple. I mean, it was, I had a heart for, actually in seminary, I invited the Mormons to come to my dorm. Can you imagine being on a Protestant seminary and then, the little elder people with the elder badge coming? And so I had a heart for the Mormons, but no matter how much I discredited their religion, how much I shared with them, they still were not converting to Christianity. Their eyes were not opening. So I came to her and I told her this, and I said, I know more about Mormonism than the Mormons. What am I doing wrong? And she shared this. She said, here's what you need to do. And this is extremely practical. She said, go to them and ask them what their testimony is. And then, after listening to their testimony, you tell them what your testimony is. And when you do that, there's going to be a difference between their testimony and your testimony. She said that they're taught to memorize their testimony, and it all has to do with their church and their religion and all that. But when you share your testimony, there's something spiritual happening. You're testifying what Christ has done in you, and they cannot deny that. So just my little thing about testimony, last thing is, I believe in the power of your testimony. It changes lives. It allows Christ to be proclaimed in their life. It's not logical, it's not all of these things, it's Christ. It's the centrality of Christ in your life, sharing it. So, the first thing from Paul's life is the centrality of Christ. The second thing that helps Paul on his mission and the overall purpose of his life is, and its strength is that he has a testimony inside of him. He has a story inside of him. And then that brings us to our last thing. And we only have one life to live. And this may be generic, right? You're like, obviously we have one life to live. But what I mean by that, after preaching through the entire book of Acts, actually I came in latter. I came in about halfway through. But there's this message that I get from Paul that, number one, he's on fire for Christ. He's a man on a mission. He's a man commissioned. But he also is a man who realizes that he only has one life to live, and he's going to make the best out of that life. He's going to live his utmost for his highest. And I don't think anybody can deny this, that Paul was on fire for Christ. He wanted to make every minute count of his life. He wrote to Timothy, he said, I've already fought the fight. I'm ready to go now. And he's going to Nero, right? So this past week, I was at a pastoral training. I love pastoral training. We gathered, it's about 150 pastors. We got together, and we gathered to learn from one another. And the main speaker was Tim Keller, and a great, amazing man, and I always learned a lot from him. So one of the cool things was we got to text in our questions to Tim Keller, right? All of these pastors ask, him one question, and they kind of choose some questions. But one person texted in the questions. They said, if you could go back 20 years in your life, which ironically was the same as that article, so God is speaking about that. If you could go back 20 years in your life, what would you change? What would you do differently in your ministry? And then Tim Keller gives this honest answer, and he says, which is surprising to me, he said, I would spend more time in prayer. If Tim Keller could go back 20 years and change his life, he said he would spend more time in prayer. And I think he's honest and right with that. I think I would do the same thing, right? How about you? And that question got me thinking, in 20 years, what will I look back and wish that I had done differently in my life? You see, I know that we only have one life to live, and I want to live my life to the fullest. I'm pretty sure you guys do too. I want to love God. I want to love my neighbors. I want to be a city on a hill that's sharing the gospel to the world. I've been saved. I've been commissioned. I've been given the greatest example of mankind, of a godly life ever given to mankind, which is Jesus Christ and his life. I have everything that I need. I just need to live it. And that's a sense that I get from Paul. He sets out to preach the gospel to the ends of the earth. I looked at a website and calculated that he traveled more than 10,000 miles on foot and by boat. He experiences beatings and stonings and whippings and shipwrecks and imprisonments. He's rejected by his own people, by the authorities, even by some of his closest friends, but yet he keeps on going. Why is that? What keeps Paul on his mission? And I believe that Paul kept on going because he realized that you only get one shot at this life, and he wanted to make it count. This is kind of sounded like a high school graduation speech, right? You only get one shot at this life, make it count, right? But this is in the scriptures. This is what I'm seeing from the life of Paul. Along those lines, growing up, I remember some sermons that had an impact on my life. And one of them actually was from my pastor in Georgia. And I was in college, and he preached this sermon. I still remember it till today. In fact, I bought the book on Amazon, just a refresh on it. It's been more than 20 years. And so the title was, the pastor in Georgia, he was giving this sermon on a book. Not based off of a book, but it was about this book. And it's from John Piper. You guys may have heard of him. And the title of his book was Don't Waste Your Life. Right? And in this book, John Piper, he writes this. He says, I will tell you what a great tragedy is. And these are John Piper's words. I will show you how to waste your life. Consider the story from February 1998. So I guess it was exactly 20 years ago. And Reader's Digest. I used to read that. Anybody read that? Reader's? Is that even around anymore? It was a really good book. Magazine, excuse me. Reader's Digest. And this is John Piper, and he says he's reading 1998 Reader's Digest. And he said, a couple took an early retirement from their jobs in the Northeast 5 years ago when he was 59 and she was 51. Now they live in Punta Gorda, Florida, where they cruise on their 30-foot trawler, play softball, and collect shells. Picture them before Christ at the great day of judgment. And John Piper does that. Just say, look, Lord, see my shells. And he says, that is a tragedy. And I remember this sermon, right? I don't remember every sermon, but I remember this from my pastor, giving an example from John Piper. Anyways, for some reason, that sermon has always stuck with me. What do I want to do with my life? Do I want to work hard my whole life to earn a bunch of money so I can retire in Florida and collect seashells? Or do I want to fight the good fight, as Paul says? Do I want to run the race in such a manner as to win the prize? Do I want to live my life that's dedicated to telling the whole world about Christ, opening people's eyes to the love of God, leading them to Jesus so that he can bring them from the power of Satan to Christ? This life is the only one that you get. You have a choice. Do you live it to glorify Jesus, or do you live it for yourself collecting, and this is one of John Piper's quotes, collecting seashells on the seashore. Collecting seashells on the seashore. Paul's life was exemplified by keeping Christ at the foremost of his life, by carrying and sharing the testimony of Christ that he had within him everywhere, and holding on to the fact that he only had one life to live, and he wanted to make his life count. Now, you guys and myself may not go and preach the gospel to Obama, right? If you do, that's awesome, right? Or whoever is president at that time. You may not be called to stand before governors and kings and nobles, proclaiming Christ's testimony inside of you. But each of us is called to know Christ, to love Christ, to seek him first in his righteousness, to take up your cross and follow Christ daily. These are our callings. Each of us is called to be a light to the world, sharing the testimony of what Christ has done in you and for you, and leading others to the power of Christ and his forgiveness away from the power of Satan and death. And each of us is called to live our life to the fullest, knowing that our time is short and we only have one life to live, and we make it count. And I'll close with this story. And all of us have role models in our lives. Hopefully you do. One of my role models was my grandmother. We called her Tawa, T-A-W-A. And it was a nickname that one of the kids, grandchildren, had given her. And Tawa was somebody that I loved to spend time with. My grandfather and her were married more than 60 years. They didn't live a perfect marriage to begin with because of the war and poverty and all of these things, but they got it right. They came to Christ. They learned to love one another even though they were imperfect. Just an amazing, amazing testimony. In fact, when I was in college, I used to go on my spring breaks and go spend time with my grandparents. I just spent a week or two. And in the summer, sometimes I think I spent 3 weeks one time with them. They were 4 hours away, so I just drive down there and spend the weekends. I love spending time with them. If you guys have grandparents or parents, spend time with them before they go. I realized that they were going to not be around forever, so I actually recorded all of the stories. They're war stories. I need to get them converted to digital before they mold. But my grandmother told all of these amazing stories. My great-grandmother was a church planter back in the woods, the loggers in Alabama. These are amazing times. But I want to get to this point. So my grandfather, he passed away, and that was he went home. He called. This is I'm like sharing too much here, but my grandfather was. I called him regularly, and one time I called him, and he said, and he was out of breath, and he said, "Don't worry about me. Keep doing what you're doing, and I'm going home. Don't worry about me." And I was like, what? And then he said, "Don't worry about me. I love you. I'm going home. Don't worry about me." And he literally said, "Keep doing what you're doing. I'm proud of you." So, and I knew when I hung up that was the last conversation, and so he died that day, but. So my grandfather loved the Lord. He went home to be with the Lord. He was ready. He died of cardiac heart failure. And so that left my grandmother by herself. My grandmother, and this sounds like a sad story, right? But it's a good point. My grandmother was by herself for years. And they were one of those couples that you thought that one of them died, the other was going to die the same day, right? They were that much in love. But my grandmother didn't die. In fact, her health got better after my grandfather, and she bought a treadmill, and she started cutting the grass, and it was crazy. Everybody's like, what's going on? And I think my grandmother was worried about my grandfather, and that kind of took a toll on her. So after he died, I would talk to her and go down and spend the weekends with her, and I said, her number one, she always thought that might be the last time we see each other. So she would always impart all of this wisdom. And but number two, she always had this overarching feeling of, why am I still here? The love of her life is in heaven. She didn't know why she was there. But what she did, and this is what I want to tell you guys, is she made the most of that time. She wasn't able to travel, although she came to our wedding, which is amazing. I'm so glad. That was the last big trip that she took. But she made the most of her time. When I went down there, my grandmother, instead of, she couldn't travel, so she started to read, or she had always read the Bible, but she would read the scriptures, and I would ask her, why are you spending so much time? And she says, I'm about to spend eternity with God. I want to know him more. You would think that she would just give up, right? And just kind of slowly, she wanted to know him more. Every year she read My Utmost for His Highest, and she would get a new copy every year, and she would write notes and notes and notes. She was a life, she actually had prayer maps of all the missionaries for her denomination, and she would pray for them every single day. She would spend hours and hours and hours before she would even come out of her bedroom. She would come out of her bedroom like 1 or 2 in the afternoon, and I would go in there, and she was just praying and spending time with God. She's my role model, and my grandfather too. So when Christ comes, or you meet him face to face, are you going to offer him seashells from the seashore? Or are you going to go down and bow at his feet and offer him your life and the fruits of your life and your labor and the testimony of the gospel and what it's done in your lives and your life and those lives around you? We have the example of Paul before us. We have the scriptures. We have the cloud of witnesses before us. It's your choice. So let me pray for you guys. Father God, we honestly and deeply love you, God. God, I pray that you multiply our time, Father, that we can spend with you. God, I pray that you, God, that you reveal to us, Father, your will, Father, for each and every one of our lives. God, to know you, to love each other, Father, and to be a city, Father, to be a light to this world, God. We thank you for this life, Father. We thank you for your testimony inside of us. Father, I pray that Jesus Christ will be central to our lives, to our hearts, to our missions, to our calling, to everything that we do, to our families, to our jobs, that you will be central, Jesus Christ. Father, and I pray that you will impart on each and every one of us that this life is short, and we only get one chance at it. That may we live it to the most, to the highest, to the fullest, Jesus Christ, glorifying you, knowing you. Jesus, I pray this. I don't even have words to pray, but I pray that you will bless us, bless your church, Jesus Christ, and speak to us through your scriptures. In your name, Jesus, we pray.